Nigeria is a strange spot. There's been several stories over the last couple of weeks about Nigerian scammers making big scores.
Yeah, there's one that I think closed down a Brazilian bank. They took so much of their money that the bank had to shut down.
What is it about Nigeria? Why are they so good at that?
This is one of the largest scams in history. A story that involves the theft of $250 million, a kidnapping, bribery, a bomb scare, the death of a security guard, the shooting of 4 policemen, a suspicious assassination, a voodoo witch, some black magic, 280,000 doves, and the foreclosure of a large international bank. This is the story of the Nigerian who sold a fake airport to a Brazilian bank and lived to scam again while the bank collapsed under his weight. Hello again and welcome to Nativi. If you're a returning viewer, we are glad to see you again. If you're new here, please like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. It's always a delight hearing from you. Most bank robberies often involve guns, not words. But what if we told you that the culprit in this video only used his words to convince a bank to part with almost $250 million? Yes, you heard that right. $250 million. Talk of being a man of your word. In the 1990s, this was said to be the third largest banking fraud at the time. But to tell you this story, we have to begin at the beginning, and the beginning began with Mr. Emmanuel Wude. Mr. Emmanuel Wude Odinigwe, popularly known as Owele of Abagana, is a Nigerian businessman with a reputation as a successful entrepreneur. He was involved in real estate, construction, property development, investment, and banking. Mr. Wude worked at the Union Bank of Nigeria, one of the leading financial institutions on the continent. He was employed there for several years, starting his tenure in the 1970s, and held various roles there, steadily climbing the ranks. After many years at Union Bank, without any formal education, he eventually became the director of the bank due to his street smarts and financial acumen. His years as a director gave him the insight into the dealings of banks and how to convincingly carry out various financial schemes. After all, as a banker himself, he was used to the entire process of giving out bank loans and investments, and therefore was aware of all the industry verbiage. In the mid-90s, Mr. Nwude hatched a plan to scam a bank, and the bank he had his sights on was the Brazilian bank Banco Noroeste. Prior to contacting Banco Noroeste, Mr. Nwude collaborated with several partners in an initial planning stage, which took months of scheming the best way to execute the scam. This planning was done in collaboration with Emmanuel Ofoluwe, who assisted in drafting and falsifying legal documents, Nzeribe Okolie, who facilitated initial communications with the Brazilian bank, Obumo Sakwe, who handled some negotiations with the bank, along with the husband and wife duo, Christian Ikechukwu Anajemba and Amaka Anajemba, who assisted in laundering the proceeds of the transaction. After the initial planning stage was over, in 1995, when everything was in place, the first faxes were sent out by Mr. Nzeribe, who claimed to be a man called Tafida Williams. Mr. Tafida Williams claimed to be the Director of Budget and Planning at Nigeria's Ministry of Aviation. Mr. Tafida laid out the plan, which was Nigeria's alleged need for a new international airport following the shift of the country's capital from Lagos to Abuja. Mr. Williams said his friend had, in the past, done repeated business with Banco Noroeste, and because of the good business, this friend had suggested the bank to Mr. Williams, proposing that Noroeste may be interested in establishing a new international airport, which they were. The man the fax was directed to was none other than Mr. Nelson Sakaguchi, the manager of Banco Noroeste. Mr. Nelson Sakaguchi was not an extraordinary banker by any means, but he was said to be a hyper-efficient one, and in his efficiency, he had protected the overseas funds of the Banco Noroeste for 14 years until Mr. Nwude entered the picture. Mr. Sakaguchi was unaware that he was the victim of an elaborate hoax. Although the friend indicated by Tafida was genuine, Tafida himself was not, instead being Mr. Nzeribe, and the alleged airport project did not exist. Sakaguchi would remain oblivious to the lie for another 3 years. Later, when the initial setup was nicely laid out and Mr. Sakaguchi already reeled in, Mr. Nwude placed a call to Banco Noroeste, claiming to be Paul Ogwuma, the then governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. He requested Mr. Sakaguchi's presence for a meeting in London, where the development of the airport was being discussed. Following the fax and this phone call by Mr. Nwude, Mr. Sakaguchi proceeded to London and was warmly received at the airport by Mr. Nwude, 2 other men, and 1 woman. Mr. Nwude identified himself in person as Paul Ogwuma, the governor of the Nigerian Central Bank. They showed him plans, blueprints, and forged legal documents, including identifications that convinced Mr. Sakaguchi he was in talks with some of the most prominent politicians and wealthiest Nigerians. The promise of substantial returns on investment and the perceived legitimacy of the transaction were key factors in convincing Mr. Sakaguchi to transfer a significant sum of money to Mr. Nwude's accounts. The way Mr. Sakaguchi saw it, the returns from the airport would improve the international investment portfolio of Banco Noroeste and help solidify the bank as a global partner. Secondly, this would establish a long partnership between the Brazilian bank and the Central Bank of Nigeria. Can you imagine Mr. Sakaguchi's excitement at this prospect? Going into a deal with the Central Bank of a nation and being the one responsible for facilitating this deal. It'll make him a legend in the banking sector in his country. Also, if this deal was as lucrative as Mr. Nwude proposed to him, then who's to say what other development deals the 2 banks would be part of within the country moving forward? It's no small feat being in the driving seat of the development of another nation. Finally, the last convincing nail on the proverbial coffin was that Mr. Nwude had also promised Mr. Sakaguchi $10 million as a commission fee if he facilitated the transaction. By the end of their meeting, Sakaguchi agreed that Banco Noroeste would invest in the construction of the airport, and to get things rolling, he gave them $35,000 in cash, trusting that Mr. Nwude would provide the nearly $40 million they promised to deposit in Noroeste. The money wasn't deposited, but between May and June 1995, Mr. Sakaguchi sent an additional $4.6 million to Nigeria in 7 installments. This was a pretty standard 419 scam, getting your victim to send you a large sum, but broken down into small installments, sent over certain milestones, so the victim doesn't suspect the heavy loss. These fraudsters hadn't seen anything like it and couldn't believe their luck. In Mr. Sakaguchi, they had found a real mugu. During this period, the so-called Mr. Tafida Williams, who was really Mr. Nzeribe, had convinced Mr. Sakaguchi to send over $4 million, which the unassuming Mr. Sakaguchi sent. And this deal didn't sit well with Mr. Nwude and his team, so they cut Mr. Nzeribe off from the rest of the heist. To prevent the scam from being traced back to him, Mr. Nwude convinced Mr. Sakaguchi to set up offshore banking accounts in the Cayman Island and transfer the funds to those accounts. The transactions were carried out via a complicated route through Switzerland and other countries, and between 1995 and 1997, Mr. Sakaguchi transferred over $190 million in cash and over $50 million in outstanding interest. This money was often in response to requests for licenses, facilitation fees, bribing money, and pretty much anything else the swindlers could think of. To cover up for 94 unauthorized wire transfers to 17 different accounts, Mr. Sakaguchi recruited 2 other employees from his bank to help manipulate the books. When they realized the transfers were illegal, these 2 bankers used this knowledge to steal money from the bank for their own purposes, further implicating poor innocent Sakaguchi. Mr. Nwude and his crew, having successfully pulled off the scam, became international socialites. They bought expensive homes in Europe and the US, started businesses in Nigeria, and started living the multi-millionaire dream on boats and exotic beaches. Unbeknown to them, these properties and investments would make tracing how they spent the money easy for investigators, which would also make it easy to recover the assets, at least in theory. Because of the enormity of the funds and not seeing any progress in over 3 years, Banco Noroeste began to struggle to remain open, opting instead to sell their entire banking assets to a larger Spanish bank in 1997. In 1998, when the Spanish bank, Banco Santander, wanted to buy the Brazilian bank, things began to unravel. As with every takeover, due diligence had to be conducted on Banco Noroeste. This meant that a thorough investigation of the Brazilian bank's financial statements was done, and it was discovered that a large sum of money, equating to 2/5 of Noroeste's total value and half of their capital, was in the Cayman Islands, a notorious tax haven. The investigation led to a number of board meetings between the two banks, and Banco Santander questioned why half of Banco Noroeste's capital was sitting in an unprotected account in the Cayman Islands. With this discovery, an emergency Spanish Inquisition was undertaken, not that kind of Spanish Inquisition, but a more humane kind of Inquisition, and Nelson Sakaguchi, head of the bank's Cayman Island branch, was recalled from his holiday for questioning. They had noticed that Mr. Sakaguchi was sending out money in batches of $6 million or less over a period of time, and this put the spotlight on him. Initially, Mr. Sakaguchi said he had lost between $9 and $12 million in currency trades, but he later admitted to having invested the money in an airport construction project in Nigeria, whose profits were expected any minute now. Poor, hopeful Sakaguchi. Mr. Sakaguchi explained that the reason he sent the money out in batches of $6 million was because he didn't want to declare it to his fellow banking colleagues, explaining that he wanted to impress his employers with a big play in Africa's most populous country. He was suspended from the bank in February 1998. Following his suspension, Mr. Sakaguchi, disheartened, crawled back home to lick his wound. Still believing in his investment deal, he called Mr. Nude, explaining the situation on ground. Mr. Nude further convinced him of the deal and the progress of the construction, and assured him that the bank would rehire him when they realized how lucrative the deal with Nigeria was. In fact, it was so lucrative a deal that they would need an additional $250,000 for some further elbow greasing for certain financial gatekeepers in Nigeria. Mr. Sakaguchi was convinced to hand over his own money after being persuaded that an extra $1 million would enable the money, which was by now inflated to $400 million, due to accrued interest, to be finally sent to Brazil. Mr. Sakaguchi was further reminded that these new funds would also unlock his $10 million commission immediately. Mr. Sakaguchi, having been reassured by this sweet-talking Nigerian, sent over the $250,000. After the suspension of Mr. Sakaguchi, a deep investigation was conducted on the various accounts in the Caymans, and, as you guessed, all roads led to Mr. Wude and the fake airport. Banco Santander almost didn't go through with the deal of purchasing the Brazilian bank, but the owners of Banco Noroeste decided to pay the missing $242 million themselves, therefore facilitating the sale of the bank to the Spanish bank Santander. The way they saw it, after selling the bank, they could recover their money from the conviction of Mr. Wude and his posies. After the sale of Noroeste to Banco Santander, the former owners of Banco Noroeste hired the services of William Ritchie, a Miami lawyer who started a global crusade to retrieve their money, eventually tracing $184 million and recovering $138 million, with $95 million of it in assets. He played the legal system in Switzerland, initially filing a criminal complaint in Geneva to freeze accounts that had received $5 million from Noroeste. At the time, this didn't seem like much of a win, but the plan was that once the court demanded the account records, they would be able to see all the other accounts it had interacted with. This account belonged to Mr. Wude, and from the transactions in the account, they identified his partners. Mr. Ritchie then filed multiple cases in countries that had stronger banking laws, so they could force Nigerian banks to recover the money from Mr. Wude. The first disclosure orders came from London, and Nigerian banks acquiesced because they were afraid their bank accounts in Britain would be closed. You see, the lavish properties Mr. Wude and his team had been acquiring in the US and the UK, including all the businesses they set up around the world, and in Nigeria especially, left paper trails, and these paper trails linked to bank accounts that linked to other offshore accounts. So, ironically, their lavish lifestyle is what did them in. The uncovering of this led to criminal investigations in Brazil, Britain, Nigeria, Switzerland, and the United States, resulting in the formation of a joint multinational criminal investigation team that united the authorities of these 5 countries. This crime rocked the financial world and was the talk of the town, bringing shame to Nigeria, so much so that in 2002, the then president, Olusegun Obasanjo, requested the formation of the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, the EFCC, as part of the joint international criminal investigation efforts to convict Mr. Wude. In Nigeria, the EFCC started an investigation on Mr. Wude, who was convicted for fraud for up to $242 million, which he denied knowing anything of. He was also convicted by the Ikeja High Court in Lagos for impersonating Paul Ogwuma, the governor of the CBN, who served from 1993 to 1999. Can you imagine being at work and getting a call about an international investigation of fraud with your name in the dead center, then rushing to turn on the TV only for all major news outlets to have your information splashed all over the screen, claiming you had committed international fraud? This was the reality of the then CBN governor. Remember that until Mr. Wude was actually found to be the criminal, for the better part of 3 years between 1995 and 1997, every party concerned in Brazil thought they were dealing with Mr. Paul Ogwuma. In February 2004, Amaka Anajemba, Emmanuel Wude, Emmanuel Ofoluwe, Nzeribe Okoli, and Obu Mosakwe were taken to the Abuja High Court with 86 counts of fraud and 15 counts of bribery. During the trial, they were warned not to bribe the court or the staff involved in the case because the sitting judge had noticed a few staff had been given money to turn a blind eye. Even though the defense team assured the judge that nothing would be done to bring scandal to the case, bribery was still uncovered. 4 Nigerian companies eventually faced charges and pleaded not guilty. The companies were Finbaz, Emrus, Ocean Marketing, and the African Shelter Bureau. The fraudsters decided to plead not guilty to over 100 counts of fraud, and in July 2004, the case was thrown out of the Abuja court over a jurisdiction dispute. The fraudsters were then relocated to the Lagos High Court, since this was the place where the fraud had been perpetrated. Things got even worse in 2005 when one of the accomplices admitted to their wrongdoing and, fearing jail time, Mr. Wude attempted to bribe Nuhu Ribadu, then head of the EFCC, with $75,000 in cash, only for the attempted bribe to be recorded on audio and used to prosecute them. But this was not all. A witness to the case was slated to testify against Mr. Wude, having key, insightful, and incriminating information. But behind the scenes, the witness was kidnapped. Well, it was an attempted kidnapping, as it was unsuccessful. Mr. Wude was charged in connection with the attempted bribery, in addition to the attempted kidnapping of the prosecution witness. Later that same year, Amaka Anajemba admitted to helping her husband, Mr. Christian Anajemba, and she was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison and ordered to repay $25 million. During Wude's trial, there was a bomb scare that caused the courthouse to be evacuated, and again, the alarm bells went up, with everyone suspecting Mr. Wude had a hand in the attempted bombing. Meanwhile, outside Nigeria, extensive investigation was still being conducted regarding the case of the Banco Noroeste, and to reduce his sentencing, Mr. Sakaguchi gave extensive testimonies that incriminated himself, some of his fellow bank members, and Mr. Nude and his associates. Brazil allowed Switzerland to hold its money laundering case in Brazil. And during the case, one of the witnesses, a voodoo priestess called Maria Rodriguez, said Mr. Sakaguchi, who wanted to change his fortune, had approached her. She requested 120,000 pure white doves from him for the ritual, which he managed to get for her. The sitting judge and the entire court were left flabbergasted. How do you even find 120,000 birds, let alone white ones?
Man, I go drop your dollar. I go take your money disappear. 419 is just a game. You are the loser. I am the winner.
It didn't end here. Seeing his eagerness and deep pocket, She requested that he send her money to buy an additional 120,000 black doves. By this time, Mr. Nelson Sakaguchi was in for all or nothing, and he sent her $20 million to pray for him. It is unclear what kind of prayers he required because it clearly didn't work, for he found himself having to go from country to country to defend himself during the investigations. Following the $75,000 bribe by Mr. Wude, the trial got Sakaguchi to be brought in as a witness, scaring the fraudster into confessing to his crimes. Mr. Wude and Mr. Nzeribe Okoli pleaded guilty after the testimony from Mr. Sakaguchi, hoping this would lead to reduced sentences. But the wrath of the EFCC, coupled with the shame their act had brought on the country, led the court, headed by Justice Joseph Oyewole, to sentence Mr. Wude to 5 consecutive sentences of 5 years in prison, a total of 25 years in prison, with Mr. Nzeribe receiving 4. All their assets were seized with the aim of returning them to the victim, and a $10 million fine was imposed on them, which was to be paid to the Nigerian federal government. With their arrest, the newly established EFCC had its very first major conviction, a victory for the Infant Commission. The funny thing is, at the time of the scam, the money was enough to build the airport in question, and Mr. Wude, had he built the airport, he, his cronies, the country, and the Brazilian bank would have benefited from this deal. And in the eventual purchase of Banco Noroeste by Banco Santander, the Spanish bank would have also benefited from the deal and assisted in financing further projects in Nigeria. We know that Nigerians often complain about not getting enough financial support from international financial institutions, but situations like this, created by one single greedy man, are one of the reasons. Instead of building a world-class airport, Mr. Wude chose to spend it on lavish houses in foreign countries, partying all over the world as an international socialite, and letting his own country languish under the weight and shame of his embarrassment. In 2016, a large-scale attack was carried out on a town in Nigeria that saw 4 policemen shot and a security guard killed. Mr. Wude was the ringleader and mastermind behind this attack and was arrested for murder charges but released later that year. In 2021, while testifying before a court, Mr. Wude denied knowing the source of the $242 million. After serving part of his 25-year jail term, he was released and ended up back in court alongside 2 lawyers, one Mr. Emmanuel Ilechukwu and another Mr. Roland Kalu, all 3 of them in court for forging the documents of a property the court had earlier ordered Mr. Wude to forfeit to his victims. Mr. Wude filed a lawsuit to recover his seized assets after he was released from prison on the grounds that some of the assets were acquired before the offense was committed. He has already reclaimed at least $50 million. Not much is known about his other accomplices, but Mr. Christian Anajemba was assassinated when the case was initially exposed. And as usual, rumors ran with different tales and fingers wagged at, yes, you guessed it, Mr. Wude. Mr. Nelson Sakaguchi was arrested at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport and dispatched to Switzerland to stand trial on charges regarding setting up bank accounts in Switzerland to facilitate the fraud. What about the Brazilian bank? Well, the Simonson and Cochrane families, the owners of Banco Noroeste, paid the missing $242 million themselves. Can you imagine being defrauded and having to still make up the losses from your pocket? However, even with this goodwill and the attempt to salvage the situation, Banco Noroeste ended up collapsing just 3 years later, in 2001, not being able to remain afloat from such a massive financial scam. The construction of the actual Abuja Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport began in 2000 and was completed in 2002 without Mr. Wude and his cronies. It now moves over 4 million passengers a year. And there you have it, folks. The tale of the man who caused a large bank to close by just using his words. What other details do you think we might have missed? Please leave your comments in the comment section below, and until next time, friends, please stay safe out there in the streets. Peace.